All right. Well, welcome to Tuesday morning Bible study. We are in Genesis, of course, and we are still in chapter 11. I'm happy to say we are looking at the Tower of Babel story. Tower of Babel. I'm just going to say Babel. In the original Hebrew, it would be something like Babel, something like that. We'll just say Babel because that's what everyone else says, and you know. It doesn't really matter that much. So we'll say Tower of Babel.
Nobody from that time is going to correct us.
No, yeah, exactly. So there we are. So we're at the Tower of Babel, chapter 11, and we were digging into it very well last week. I don't want to spend much more time on it, but I do want to touch on something or I'd like to continue a discussion that we started last week, bring it to a conclusion, and then we'll move on to the latter part of chapter 11. Last week we said that essentially what's going on here is, well, there are multiple things going on here, but among the things that are going on here is a recognition that human beings have ways of seeking immortality. And one of the classic ways that we seek immortality is by the building of great works they're sort of whether consciously or unconsciously, they are our bulwark against nothingness, to use a phrase that Thomas Merton, the great Trappist monk Thomas Merton, once used, a bulwark against nothingness. And the reason that we saw that the builders of the tower did this building was because they wanted to make a name for themselves, lest they be scattered abroad upon the face of the earth. That is to say, build a monument to themselves, in a sense, so that their name will last, as opposed to drifting into nothingness, drifting into anonymity. And of course, this prompts God to remind these people of their essential nature. And we noted last week, my mom made a really nice connection between what's going on here, the way God comes in to thwart this human drive to essentially transcend its own natural limits. How God steps in, just as God stepped in when Adam and Eve had eaten the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden. And then after having done that, and after having incurred the issue with that, incurred the curse of that, then they might reach out for the tree of life and live forever. And I mean, again, in both cases, both in that case and in this case, it has to do with a human reach for immortality. And God steps in and puts the quash on that. And so last week, the point that I was making, was that we see that still today in our own attempts at immortality. Maybe not literal immortality. I mean, but the way we, like the whole health industry, the denial of old age, the denial of death, all the ways that we try to turn the clock back and essentially deny our mortal nature. We also see it in technology and in the various ways that we seek to transcend ordinary human limitations. One particularly interesting thing that we see these days is I'm thinking of biomedical technology, and the capacity that human beings may have in the not so distant future to augment our human brains with technological implants. I mean, we already have access to almost all human knowledge. If we know where to go, if we know how to use it, we already have access to almost all human knowledge through our phones. We can look up facts anyway. I mean, it's just astonishing the access that we have. Now imagine this. Imagine an external device being wired into our neural network. Imagine some kind of thing where Google or Microsoft or whatever, where the same thing that is now external, I have to type in a search, actually gets wired into our brains. And if you think that's science fiction, it's not that terribly far off. It's called transhumanism. Just the kind of the possible future marriage of biology with technology. If that freaks you out just a little bit, or more than a little bit, it probably should, because it freaks me. I know it freaks me out just a little bit. And it raises all kinds of questions about what is a human being, really, and how much of this can we absorb in the name of convenience before our essential humanity begins to come into question. I mean, already we, just with, external devices, we have people that are so into their devices that they no longer, they seem to be losing the capacity to have actual, real face-to-face human interactions. I mean, in other words, even external technologies impact our ability to function as humans and
to attempt at immortality, though, Tom.
Yeah, what's that, Bill?
It's not an attempt at immortality; it's an attempt at complete knowledge.
Okay.
Which is a different thing, and I think
it's related, but you're right. Yeah,
a simple attempt at immortality is writing a great play, or a great poem, or a great book, or a great document. I think that's more what I think of human attempts to achieve immortality, like the Tower, that would last forever.
I think that's right.
Some few people thus far have achieved that through their Shakespeare, obviously. Example. Another one, perhaps the writers of the Bible thus far. I mean, even all of those aren't going to be immortal, but thus far, that's been the best example I can see.
Yeah, they're doing a pretty good job so far. But
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. there's a, I know that probably most of you are not into sci-fi. Some of you may be, but one of the very best sci-fi series to deal with these kinds of issues, with immortality, with what does it mean to be a human being, how does technology factor into what is and isn't human. It's the reboot of it's the 2004 to 2009 reboot of Battlestar Galactica. Absolutely, if you have any appreciation for science fiction, the 2004 to 2009 reboot of Battlestar Galactica is absolutely unparalleled in its brilliant exploration of these kinds of issues. So if you have any interest in that kind of thing, and you have Netflix or Hulu, or I forget which streaming service would actually carry the whole run, but it's absolutely fantastic. It's just, what's interesting to me is that we're having these kinds of conversations in the 21st century, and I mean, in many ways, they're more relevant than ever. And yet we also see the same impulses to immortality, to complete knowledge. I mean, that's what Adam and Eve did in the first place, was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Was a kind of, they desired knowledge like God has, you know. And we see those impulses, you know, in these ancient texts, that those same human impulses being played out. All right. Okay. Why don't we start then at verse 10? Let's look at verse 10 now. Once again, we have another genealogy. This is going to, incidentally, this is the last genealogy that we have for a while. Okay, if you're tired of genealogy, this is the last one we have for a while. And its similarities to some other genealogies that we've already seen are noteworthy, and we'll note them very soon. So let's look at chapter 11, verse 10. These are the descendants of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after the birth of Arpachshad 500 years and had other sons and daughters. When Arpachshad had lived 35 years, he became the father of Shelah. And Arpachshad lived after the birth of Shelah 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he became the father of Eber. And Shelah lived after the birth of Eber 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Eber had lived 34 years, he became the father of Peleg. And Eber lived after the birth of Peleg 430 years and had other sons and daughters. When Peleg had lived 30 years, he became the father of Ru. And Peleg lived after the birth of Ru 209 years and had other sons and daughters. When Ru had lived 32 years, he became the father of Serug. And Serug lived after, or Ru lived after the birth of Serug 207 years and had other sons and daughters. When Serug had lived 30 years, he became the father of Nahor. And Serug, I tell you what, I'm going to mute everybody. And if you have a question or want to make a comment or something, we'll chime in. Let's see. Here we go. Okay. Either unmute yourself or hold down the space bar, because we're getting some background noise and stuff. It's kind of distracting. Okay. When Serug had lived 30 years, he became the father of Nahor, and Serug lived after the birth of Nahor 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he became the father of Terah, And Nahor lived after the birth of Terah 119 years and had other sons and daughters. When Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Let's pause there. Again, if you want to make a comment or you have a question, or if there's anything you want to say at all, please unmute yourself, or either unmute yourself on the lower left-hand corner of your screen, or hold down your space bar and speak and use it almost like a walkie-talkie, like a CB or a walkie-talkie. Okay. Now, so we're going into genealogy again. There are a couple of features of this that are really interesting. One is that we've already been treated to some of the family of Shem, to some of the descendants of Shem. So this is a retelling. This is a retelling of chapter 10, verses 21 through 30. Remember, chapter 10 was the table of nations. Okay, it was was talking about the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Okay, and in chapter 10, verses 21 through 30, you will note, in 21 through 30, you will note that they've already talked a little bit about the family of Shem. So this is a retelling here in chapter 11. There is a really interesting difference between the two accounts, though. If you look at chapter 10, verses 21 through 31, you will note that the emphasis in chapter 10, verses 21 through 31 is on brothers and sisters. Again, it's part of the table of nations, and so it's interested in establishing how lots of different peoples are related to each other, right? That was the purpose of chapter 10. You will remember. Okay. There we go. That was how they were. That was the purpose of that. Was that that they're all related to each other. And so the emphasis then is on just laying out all the different family relationships. Here in chapter 11, though, that's not the purpose. The purpose is to concentrate on a singular line, right? It's not interested in everybody's brothers and sisters. It's interested in showing a particular line of descent, saying that so-and-so became the father of so-and-so, and then that father had other sons and daughters, but doesn't name them. The focus is on a singular line. And it's clear by the time we get to verse 26, it's clear why the genealogist is doing that. Because it's supposed to lead, the point of all this is to lead from Shem to Abram, or as we will know him soon in chapter 17, Abraham. Okay, that's the point. That's the storyteller's point, is to show us the connection between Shem and eventually Abraham. So that's one difference between between chapter 10, 21 through 30 and the retelling in chapter 11. Now there's also, you will recognize, a parallel to another genealogy. Hold your place in chapter 11. You will note there's a parallel, maybe is not quite the right word. There's a notable similarity to another genealogy if you turn to chapter 5. you turn to chapter 5 and look at the entire chapter, okay, the entire chapter of 5, you have a genealogy that again focuses on a singular line, except in chapter 5, the line is from Adam to Noah. Okay. Notice another similarity. You have a similar formula where a person is mentioned, a father figure is mentioned. It then says that when he was X years old, he had the next one in the line, and then lived after the birth of said child for a certain amount of years and had other sons and daughters, okay, and then died. And then it keeps going. Then that child then becomes a father when he was so and so years old. He had, and so down for 10 generations. 10 generations in Adam to Noah. Guess how many generations from Shem to Abraham? 10. 10 generations. Same thing, same formula in the telling of each generation. Now, here's one final little thing. Take a look at, and I want you to have that moment of discovery. Look at chapter 5, verse 32. Chapter 5, verse 32, and compare it to chapter 11, verse 26. It's the end of the line of each genealogy. Each genealogy has functioned in a singular line format and ends, in chapter 5 case, it ends in verse 32. In chapter 11's case, it ends at verse 26. Tell me a similarity between those two, the ends of both of those recountings. Again, it's been a singular line. It's been father, son, father, son, father, son, father, son.
It ends with 3 children, maybe?
Ends with 3 children. All right. 3 sons specifically.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It ends with 3 sons. This entire time for all these generations, in each case, it was father, son, father, son, father, son, father, son. And then the last generation, or in the very last step, the father has 3 sons. And it names 3 sons that the father figure has, as opposed to carrying it just through a singular person. Okay, so 3 sons at the end of chapter 5, and now, in the same way, it's an interesting storytelling device. Now we have 3 sons. When Terah, chapter 11, verse 26, when Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Okay. There's one other thing I want you to notice. And by the way, it's obvious, the same source. It's the same source that gave us, the same writer that gave us chapter 5 is the same writer that gave us this part of chapter 11. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but it's the same source. It's the priestly source that gives us both of these accounts. And they use this common literary technique in both cases. But there is a very interesting difference between, a difference between 5 and 11. What do you suppose that is? Try to remember just details of chapter 5 and then compare it to some of the details of verses 10 through 26 in chapter 11. I mean, you got your 10 generations, singular line, ends with 3 sons. There's one very notable difference between the two genealogies. Everybody want to take a shot at it? Folks aren't living as long.
Oh,
You notice in the chapter 5 genealogy, you've got people living, people being, 500 years old when they have so and so, and then they live for another several hundred years or whatever, and then they die. You notice the lifespans in chapter 11 are notably reduced. Now from our point of view, they're still long, okay? But people are living, 200, 230, 250 years rather than 900 years. The lifespans are seriously reduced. Okay. That's interesting. I mean, that's just an interesting thing. And you have to figure that has something to do, from the storyteller's point of view, that has something to do with the flood. That has something to do with the great change that happened with the flood. That the further out we get from Adam, on whom a curse was placed, the further out we get from Adam, the closer we get to a time, the closer we get to a time where lifespans are more in line with what we're used to, what we're accustomed to, such that the psalmist, now of course that's not book of Genesis, where the psalmist is going to speak of the lifespan of a human being 70, and then another 10 if you're really lucky. In other words, 70 lifespan of a human being 70 years old, or 80 if you're really lucky. Now, of course, modern technology and medicine and stuff, we can happily extend that further too. But point being that by the time we get to the time of the psalmist, in the storytelling of the psalmist, our understanding of what a human lifespan is, or the psalmist's understanding of what a lifespan is much closer to our idea of what a human lifespan is, versus, some of the more, the far more fanciful and remarkable kinds of lifespans that are expressed in these early chapters of Genesis. So here we are. What we have accomplished is, or what the priestly writer has accomplished, we have been on this grand journey from creation, building up to the flood. The flood then is a major turning point, not just for human beings, but a turning point for God, as we have seen. Major turning point. And then with life after the flood, the human heart is still corrupt. The flood didn't stop the corruption of human beings. The difference, of course, is in how God sees it, God's attitude towards it. God is no longer going to allow himself the option, no longer allow himself the nuclear option. We may choose the nuclear option, but God won't. Okay. And so God has changed his mind, but then the human heart is still corrupt, but God is working with us with patience. And then what we see following the flood is this increasing interest in the from the storyteller's point of view, an increasing interest in first showing how this small family coming out of the ark is the source of all the nations of the earth. And yet, as soon as the storyteller does that, he then wants to start focusing, and thus the genealogy of chapter 11 wants to begin to go down from this grand table of nations and to start to focus on a single family again, focus on a single line. And thus we get to the sons of Terah in verse 26. He became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. All right. We are on the cusp of beginning chapter 12, but we're going to finish chapter 11 today. But with chapter 12 is the beginning of what we call the patriarchal narrative. Basically, the rest of Genesis. The rest of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, are the patriarchal narrative, in that it is telling the story of this single family, this single, very human, complicated, messy, and in many important ways dysfunctional family. In other words, families. Okay. Kind of like families we all know, right? Okay. So here we go. So verse 27. Now these are the descendants of Terah. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. Now we know Lot, and if you know anything about Genesis, you know Lot's going to be, he's going to be an important character here soon. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai. We know her later as Sarah, of course. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. This is bad, okay? From in that culture, that time, that culture, that point of view, to be childless was a living death. Precisely because the Israelite, or actually this was true across the ancient world, but we see it very much in Israelite society, is that the one kind of immortality that God seemed to be okay with people having was the idea of building a posterity, establishing a family and establishing posterity and so forth. And that was like the one example of your name living on that God seemed to be okay with. In fact, God seemed to bless. And so to be denied that, to not have that, is the worst kind, from this point of view, from this cultural point of view, the worst kind of meaninglessness. Meaninglessness. And so this is important, that Abram's wife, Sarai, is barren. That's going to set up the essential problem that the next 6 or 7 chapters will attempt to resolve. Okay? The essential test of faith that God and Abram are going to be wrestling with each other. The essential problem of how does one have a posterity promised by God when his wife is barren? And God makes a promise to said person, knowing that his wife is barren. What do you do about that? Do you do anything about that? Do you trust God that somehow the promise is going to be good? Do you take matters into your own hands? We will see, of course, that both of those options were played out. Both of those options are played out in the chapters of Genesis to come, but I don't want to anticipate it too much because it's all really, really good. All right. So then in verse 31, Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Okay, so the way it's presented is Haran is not the promised land, not the land that God is ultimately promising Abram, but nevertheless is nevertheless a place that is not their home. It's not the place that they're going to be stopping. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, I don't want to get into it too much, but we get a little bit of this tension here in between here and then in chapter 12. What seems to be the case is that the Yahwist writer had one tradition for the origin of Abraham, and the priestly writer had another tradition. And so then the redactor is actually trying to make, like one tradition has Haran as Abram's home, and the other is trying to make presents Ur as Abram's home. And what the redactor then is doing is trying to kind of bring those two accounts together so that they're not in bold contradiction to each other. And I'm not interested in going into the details of how what the redactor did in order to make that happen, but you can easily see how there could be a confusion about that. I like to think, this is just me and my own genealogical bone, are my folks from Scotland, or are they from Ireland? Well, in a way, both are true. My Scots-Irish ancestors, are they from Scotland or are they from Ireland? Well, both are true in a way. They actually did come from Ireland. Before they came to America, the ship they got on to get to America embarked from Ireland. And they had lived in Ireland for, like 100 years. And so, multiple generations had come and gone in Northern Ireland before they made it to America, but their forebears were from Scotland. And thus the term the Scots-Irish, the Scots-Irish as opposed to the Irish. It has nothing to do with anything, but actually it does kind of have to do with this, in that whether we think of Haran as Abram's home, or Haran is kind of like Northern Ireland in this analogy, and Scotland is kind of like Ur in this analogy. Okay, now if that didn't make any sense to you, please just forget I ever said it. All right. So here we are. We have the family. The family that we're going to be focusing on is in Haran. And now with chapter 12, the action begins. Now we're going to start with the first 9 verses. We're going to read the first 9 verses. We'll revisit them a little bit next week. I don't want to go too into chapter 12 with with some Wendy's not here with us either today too. So some key members of this Bible study. I want everybody together when we start chapter 12 proper and we really get into the meat of it. I also want everybody, or as many people as possible, to be here when we get into the story that starts in verse 10, chapter 12, verse 10, because it's the first of three such stories that will strike us as weird. Okay. The story of how a foreign king starts to take a patriarch's wife as his own and potentially messes up the divine promise. Okay. And this happens to Abraham in the story in Genesis. This happens to Abraham twice, and it happens to Isaac once. And every single time it's weird. It's just a weird story in each case, but it serves a narrative purpose. Okay. And the purpose being that it illustrates how the divine promise can be imperiled and how we get past, how the family gets past the peril of the divine promise being in danger. Okay. All right. So let's start. Chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And I want to pause there. These three verses are about as important as any three verses in the entire Old Testament. There is so much that is based on these three verses. There's the theme of faith. I mean, honestly, this is the first time, the first of many times, that faith is the operative reality, the thing that human beings are called upon to have or to exercise. Okay. That's going to be true, of course, for the rest of the Bible. But this is the first great time. Now there's Noah, God telling Noah to get, to build an ark and all that. But, Noah could just trust that the divine was trying to save his life, save his family's life from a coming flood, because everyone's wicked around him. And Noah could perfectly well see for himself that everyone was wicked around him. What God is calling Abram to do is to do something radically different, to go from his settled life, the life that he knew, the people that he knew, the country that he knew, and in his old age. Okay. And this would be one thing if he was, if he was 25 years old and unmarried, that would be one thing. But he's an old man at the beginning of this. And he's told effectively to start over, to go to a place you've never seen before and start over. And I'm going to make you a father of many nations. I'm going to give you posterity. Now, we've already noted at the end of chapter 11, we've noted his wife is barren and they have no children. And so God is making a kind of double promise. He's going to take him and protect him in a land that God will show him, and he will make of him a great nation. The first is just a great test of faith. It's, I'm, why not stay where I am? Why not stay where I am, where I, better the devil, right? I mean, yeah. I mean, anywhere you live, there's going to be hardships and there are going to be challenges and whatnot, but at least I know what they are and I can manage them. Who knows what's going to happen when I go to this place I've never been before, right? So there's that test of faith. But then there's just the obvious fact he doesn't have any children, and his wife is barren, and yet God's telling him that he's going to be the father of many nations, that he's going to make of him a great nation. And there's just no present evidence that that's even possible. Okay. No present evidence that that's even possible. And so it's kind of a double challenge that's laid at the feet of Abram here. There's also this business about verse 2. It says, I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. That's an interesting turn of phrase. I mean, God will, the promise is that God will bless him. But the promise is also that in being blessed, that you will be a blessing because you have been blessed, or as a consequence of your having been blessed, that you will be a blessing, a source of blessing to others. Wow. It's not just about you. It's not just about me. It's not just about you. It's about us. It's not just about me being enriched. It's about how, in being enriched, I can enrich the lives of others. This is a remarkable turn. This is really a remarkable turn, because on one hand, we can ask the question, and it's natural to ask, why is God focusing on a single family? Why is God going from this table of nations in chapter 10 and focusing on this singular family? Well, it seems to be that it's not just a single family that God is interested in blessing. He's actually interested in blessing the whole world, but he's doing it through the instrumentality of one family and blessing that one family, so that from that one family, the blessing that comes on that one family is a blessing that ultimately spreads to the whole world. And understand that, we can think of this as something that is happening to Abraham, like Abraham of history. This is happening to a person, but this is also as being part of the grand Israelite narrative. This is Israel telling its own story to itself. In other words, this is not only an account of what our ancestor Abraham was told by God. This is an account of how we see ourselves and our purpose. That we are a nation that has been blessed by God so that the nations of the world can be blessed as well. That is an amazing statement. Or that is an amazing concept for a people to hold. Not that every individual held it, but it's remarkable that a nation would develop a narrative in which it would see its own divine favor as not being an end in itself, that it would be to the end of being a blessing to all the other nations. a light to the other nations, to the benefit of the other nations. That it's not just about us. It's not just about our own chosenness. Okay. Now we know that the part of the reason why that's remarkable is because we know that runs against human nature. Because human nature is that when our human nature is to hoard. Okay. We get something good and we want to keep as much of it as we can, right? That sharing is not necessarily something that comes naturally, especially if you feel threatened or you feel insecure. Now, if you feel really, really secure, you can afford to be generous. You can afford to, to bless everybody. But what if you're not? What if you're an oppressed people? What if you're a people that's always on the bad end of fortune? It is amazing that a nation that has traditionally been on the bad end of fortune, okay, would develop a self-understanding that the divine blessing that is meant to come to them is not meant to be hoarded by them, that it's meant to be shared in the midst of their insecurity. Wow. I mean, really just what a remarkable reality is packed into this seemingly harmless verse in verse 2. In verse 2. This seeming something you could just read and just pass over. Oh, isn't that nice? Blessed to be a blessing. It's absolutely remarkable that this would be part of Israel's self-understanding, because that's what it is. This is a reflection of what the storyteller, anyway, as an Israelite theologian, it's amazing that this notion would be a centerpiece of the Israelite self-understanding as expressed by this storyteller. And so then in verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So this is not only a statement of a prescriptive statement. It's not just a statement of this is how Israel should act. Israel should act as a blessing to others, but it's also a statement of divine promise. Not just Israel, you've been blessed, so you should be a blessing to other nations. You may not, and then that's you should be. You are not always that, but you should be that. But there's more going on here. It's not just that. It's not only that you should be a blessing to other nations, but that in fact, in God's economy, in God's working out of all things, it's your destiny. It's your destiny that you will be a blessing to all nations, that all the families of the earth shall be blessed through you. So it is divine promise. Not always evident in the way, in real time, in the way things seem to work out, in human failings and human beings hoarding their blessings and whatnot, but as a statement of divine promise, that it is your destiny. It is your divine destiny that you will, in spite of your humanity, you will become the vehicle by which all the families of the earth are blessed. If you are a Christian, and I believe all of us are, we will no doubt see in Jesus at least one important dimension of how that divine promise is fulfilled. You know, now again, that obviously could not have been anticipated or thought of by the writer of Genesis here. But nevertheless, we can see in the Christian revelation how Jesus is at least one important dimension of how this promise plays out. Okay, what time is it? It's 11:30. This is probably a great time not to go any further because if we do, we're going to get into some stuff. And I really do want to say verse 10 through the rest of chapter 12. I really do want to save that to next time. Because it's such a great story, and it's a weird story. It serves a purpose, but it is a weird story by any standard. So comments, questions, thoughts, things you've noticed reading so far today. And do unmute yourself if you do. If you do have something to say, do unmute yourself.
Hey, Tom, it seems that God is also promising that he's going to be on their side against anybody who stands up, opposes them. So, that gives you a sort of self-righteous attitude about things, it would seem to me.
It can feed into the natural human impulse, certainly. And we see that we see that played out, throughout history, not only in the history of Israel, but in the history of any nation that sees itself as divinely chosen in some fashion. Certainly, I mean, you think of the way in which America has seen itself. I mean, that we're talking about classes that I've done before or things that I've taught on before. And a few weeks ago, I talked about a class that I taught on the how the role of religion in the building of Southern identity from the colonial period through the Civil War and so forth. Talked about that. But I've also, in more distant past, I've taught about the role of religion in the building of American identity. Beyond the Southern, but the general American identity, and the understanding that was very much not part of the Revolutionary period so much, but was part of the Puritan and the in Puritan New England in the 17th century, but then also later on in the 19th century, following the American Revolution. And the building of this strong notion in the 19th century that America was a nation that was divinely chosen of God, was a kind of new Israel with promises that come with that. There's a dark side to that, of course. If you're the new Israel, you come into the promised land, there are people to kick out. Right? Israel comes into the promised land, they kick out all the Canaanites, they kill all the Canaanites, right? And there were people following this line of theological reasoning, said, well, that's, the Native Americans are the Canaanites. They're the ones that need to be kicked out. And so America had a divine destiny, a manifest destiny to push all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And that kind of behavior that did just roll over people often had religious justifications attached to it. In the vein of America as the new Israel. So, it's obvious you don't have to go very far in in the Bible to find those kinds of supports. If that's what you want to do, you're a new country and you want to make it as easy as possible for new settlers, especially settlers that look like you, to to come in and build a country. It's easy to find that biblical justification in the name of the new Israel, to find that biblical justification for eliminating the peoples that were here before. They're not part of the project. So the reasoning went. And and some of the horrors of American history have come from these appropriations, these misappropriations of the biblical tradition.
Okay, one more question. Do you think that promise could have had anything to do with the Jewish people misreading the Holocaust at an early enough stage to do something? I mean, thinking if they're the chosen people and God is on their side, was it harder for them to realize what was going on?
I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. Well, how does the Holocaust play into it? I wasn't sure about that.
Well, if you believe you're the chosen people and God is on your side,
right,
and God must have some purpose in all this suffering that is being imposed upon you.
Right.
I don't know.
Well, yeah, biblically,
I'm just wondering.
Well, biblically speaking, I mean, in terms of the sufferings of national Israel in the Old Testament, the standard prophetic explanation for Israel's suffering was that Israel had sinned.
Okay.
And specifically, and not just sinned, not just like individual Israelites, telling fibs and cheating maritally and all this kind of stuff, but breaking the terms of the covenant. And I've taught extensively, on what the covenant is, and that the covenant essentially is an agreement between God and a people about how we're going to organize ourselves, how we're going to live, and how our life in community is going to reflect the nature and character of God. And the biggest way that we do that, the biggest way our society represents the nature and character of God, is by the way we take care of one another, right? And when elites start trampling over the poor and oppress people and don't take care of the widow, the orphan, or the alien, that is marring the image of God that we all are. And so that is breaking the terms of the covenant, and that becomes a basis for failure, a basis for national failure, a people's failure, and a people's suffering. And so that was the standard go-to explanation. Eventually, of course, that explanation begins to run out, or at least it begins to lose some of its explanatory power when you have suffered you've suffered a certain amount. You begin to say, look, we're not perfect, but we're not that bad. Our suffering is way out of proportion to whatever God you think we've done, and eventually you begin to develop alternative explanations. And I've talked about how the rise of the apocalyptic mindset is kind of an evolution of the standard prophetic explanation of suffering. The apocalyptic explanation begins to see, yes, there is suffering that comes about because you've screwed up, but there's also suffering that comes about because there are evil forces at work in the universe that are working against you, like the devil, demons, that kind of thing, forces that are sworn enemies of God, sworn enemies of the good, and are seeking to thwart God's will and purposes. And so developed Israel's understanding of some suffering coming from the fact that there are enemies of God at work that are working to hurt us. And so that becomes a good go-to explanation for suffering, especially suffering that takes the form of oppression. Now the Holocaust, of course, the 20th century Holocaust is that's just kind of a whole new. I mean, in some ways it's like things that have gone before, but in other ways it's goes way beyond it. And it goes without saying that the Holocaust, the experience of it, occasioned a tremendous crisis of faith within the Jewish community, within Jewish theology. And there's no one standard theological reaction in the Jewish community. There have been many different reactions. Some have been rejection of God. Have been, how many people that you know are ethnically Jewish or connected to the Jewish community who are personally atheists or agnostics. Lots. I do anyway. A lot who identify as Jewish for family or cultural reasons, but who in their own personal belief system are agnostics or atheists. Well, that's largely that is in many ways a legacy of the Holocaust, and if I may say so, not terribly hard to understand either. That's one reaction, but there are other reactions. Some reactions have been, not many explanations have been centered around the idea that we have, that we've just sinned so much that we deserved it. That is not a typical Jewish response to the Holocaust. There are others that just, there are others though that have accepted it as part of just the mysterious divine will, just kind of in the spirit of Job, not trying to explain it, but just simply accepting it. And in that wonderfully classic Jewish way of theological reasoning, both blessing God and arguing with God at the same time. So, at the one hand, you're angry at God on, like you're looking this way, you're angry with God, but then you go and say your prayers, and you see this spirit in, if you've ever read Elie Wiesel, like the Night trilogy, Elie Wiesel, he passed away just a few years ago. He's, and of course, a Holocaust survivor, Auschwitz survivor. And he's a wonderful example of someone who, in the name of human dignity, can rail against God. I mean, like to God's face, rail against God. Why did you allow this? Why did this happen? And yet, also, the same person can be, faithful in the saying of the prayers and carrying out the tradition. And so it's like, it's something that the Jewish tradition has such a wonderful capacity for that kind of paradox, or that kind of tension, where you can be angry with God, and that your anger with God is part of your faith. It's part of your faithfulness to God, is that you love and trust God so much that you don't mind telling him off sometimes, and you're secure enough in your relationship with God so much that you don't mind sometimes telling God off. You don't really have that in the Christian tradition anywhere near like you have it in the Jewish tradition. And I think Christians would do themselves an enormous favor by learning from that. learning from that Jewish tradition. And I think it, in the name, but because Christians will back away from that kind of thing in the name of piety, in the name of not being blasphemous or whatever. And I think the biblical rooting for that kind of tension that we find surviving in the Jewish tradition, I think is actually so important, such an important feature of the Hebrew Scriptures. I mean, I think it's right at the heart of the Hebrew Scriptures is this this kind of relationship with God that can both love God and argue with God at the same time. Yeah, it's good stuff. Good stuff. All right. Well, I know we are. It's 11:45, so we really ought to wrap up. I know my mom had to disappear, and I knew that Bill had to go away too. I hope both of them, Bill, Mom, I hope you will be able to see the end of this this video. But anyway, well, it's been a pleasure being with all of you. Next week, this is the important part, an important thing. Next week, week from today, Lisa and I are going to be in our car, in line. At this moment, at 11:46, we will be in line waiting for our second Moderna vaccine shot. Yay. Yeah. And so I will not be able to do Bible study on Tuesday. Just a show of hands, if we wanted to reschedule it to Wednesday, 10:30, how many of you would be able to do that if we decided to do that? How many of you would be available for that? Okay, Sandy. I don't see many other hands. Okay, so what we'll do, we'll skip next week. We'll skip next week, and then we'll move on to we'll begin again 2 weeks from today. I am happy to say, kind of in the vein of some missed Tuesdays that we had to do back a few months ago. I'm happy to say that Lisa is doing great. She has made a big comeback. She's gained weight. She's eating so much better. Her appetite has returned. Honestly, I mean, we just had a doctor's appointment this morning. She's about as, I mean, she's still got issues, and there medications that she takes that she needs to keep taking, and she will probably keep taking many of them for the rest of her life. So it's not like everything is just there. So, and we've still got things we've got to keep our eyes on, but she's doing really well, and I appreciate everybody's prayers and support and patience during that time where we were having to break away from Bible study. And I hated doing that, but the reasons why. So, all right. Well, good being with all of you. And if I don't see you before, I will see you 2 weeks from today then. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.